thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate your audience. I appreciate Lena for hosting us in her exhibition. And I'm going to try to make it as informal as possible. This is not really a lecture. It's more like exchanging ideas. And the idea initially came about when Roland and I were talking during the exhibition. And Lena's exhibition is all about, you know, the origins and origins of life, the stars, Earth, Eve. It's all sort of connected, and there's always a message behind art and behind every exhibition, which sometimes people miss. People just come in and look and enjoy the art pieces and have a sip of wine and they leave. But there's always something behind it, and there's always an idea. So we thought that we would take this a step further and think a little bit about the origins. I call it of humanity, but we can say the origins of life, the origin of creation, and there's a lot of debate around this topic. So over the years, medical school, philosophy, art, music, you accumulate ideas, and I'm here to just test those ideas with you, and so that we can discuss it. This is not telling you what is right or what is wrong. This is just shedding a light here and there so that we can think about things. Anybody? What is this? Anybody? Apple. The origin of sin. Okay. Reminds us of maybe Newton. Okay? The apple falling on the head. Adam, Eve.
Or the beginning of self-consciousness.
Mac.
The beginning of self-consciousness.
Beginning of self-consciousness. Very good. Excellent. I start with this for two reasons. One, so that we can kind of orient ourselves to, you know, this apple thing, knowledge, sin, blah, blah, blah. And at the same time, just to tell you a humorous story about how did the Apple logo came about to be. Why is it that the initial logo was not this? It was a picture of Newton under the tree with an apple falling. And then Steve Jobs decided, no, we need something simpler. So they hired somebody. They came up with Apple being Apple knowledge, infinity, blah, blah, blah. But the reason Jobs decided that to take this as the symbol is because of a phone book. Because in the phone book, if you write Apple, at the time there was no Google, it comes before Atari, A-P-A-T, and that's how it came about. The idea behind this is that sometimes what you look at something, it's not what it seems. The story is somewhere else. Okay, so who was the first human? Anybody?
According to whom?
Lucy. Anybody? Adam? An ape? Nobody knows. We're all adults. We've lived our lives. We've heard it in temples, churches, you know, places of worship. We've heard it at school. We've heard it in science. We still don't know the answer. Let's talk a little bit of science. What we have is fossils, right? So we look at fossils, we try to analyze them, we try to draw back a scenario. Okay, this is human remains that exceeds 10,000 years. That's all we know. So automatically we can deduce that life, or humans, existed more than 10,000 years ago, correct? Okay, I don't know why this is updating, but sure. Okay. So building this to that, you can create molds, sculptures, and you create that maybe this is how they looked like. Other people, you know, came up with this kind of a model. Either way, it's a model of a creature that inhabited the earth around this time. This was called Homo habilis, and actually it was dated back through technology and DNA, whatever, to about 2.5 million years ago. So we know I didn't put all the pictures, but you know, there are things that have been collected throughout the world, and we know that this is a fact. So now we're in, you know, when did the humans come about? About 2.5 million years ago. Okay. They called them handymen because that's when they started using tools. And the origin was pinpointed to Africa. When this information came about, some people took offense at that. You know, why Africa? It must be somewhere else.
Because of the break of Phrygia.
Well, some people thought that, you know, it's a good thing that it was not in China, otherwise they would have eaten the serpent and not the apple. So, with those collection of data, they were able to map that we went through developmental changes as a species. And perhaps we started out somewhere over there, and eventually we became the human form that we know of today, or what they now call human erectus, meaning the human that can stand on 2 feet. And I can talk, by the way, for like 3 days on this, but like, you know, little interesting things. Our defect as human erectus is actually the gluteal muscles and the butt, because that's what makes us stand up, but there are other disadvantages for that, and we can talk about it later. Anyway, so the different stages of development, we have data that says there's this, you know, part of this development, human rudolfensis, whatever, 1.9 million years ago, and then Homo erectus came about at about 100,000 years ago. Okay? This is fact, this is data. And the shape changed. Throughout time in history, there were groups of people that actually dominated for a big chunk of time, the Neanderthals, we all know this name, and the Denisovans. The Denisovans lived in Africa, the Neanderthals more were prone to be living in Europe. And the idea in science came about that did these people live separately, or did they intermingle? And most likely they did intermingle, because we could see traits from this kind and this kind coming up through time. And this is how genetic makeup gets mixed up, etc., etc. Art, which I love, also tells us about these things. It's not just science. These are findings in caves in South America, I think, where you see that humans gathered. They always stayed together and they intermingled. And these are different types of sets of hands of different species, all at the same time, in caves that are as old as more than 10,000 years ago. Okay. I don't want to dwell too much on history because I'm not an expert in history, but I'm giving you the guidelines, okay? So let's talk a little bit more science. We know DNA, we now know that DNA exists, and we can investigate through DNA going backwards. Max Planck studied DNA sequences from human material and human fossils, etc., etc., and they now know that we all carry DNA in us that is of Neanderthal origins. I'm bringing it up so that we all kind of have to think that science is telling us that these were actually our ancestors, somehow. Okay? There's a 13-year-old girl that lived about 90,000 years ago. The remains exist. They analyzed the DNA from those fossils, and they discovered that her father was of a Denisovan origin, Africa, where the mother was of a Neanderthal origin. This also proves that there was intermixing between those groups, even at that time. This is a Denisovan, this is a Neanderthal, just so that we can sort of look at the differences. They're related, but they're not quite the same. All right, I'm going to skip now the human thing, and I'm going to take it down into the molecular level. We'll come back to the human in a bit. So what is life? Okay, how did it arise? If we don't think in terms of human, let's just think in terms of life. Some people say Big Bang. Some people say, you know, Darwin, evolution, blah, blah, blah. At the molecular level, here's a little experiment that was done by Francesco Rudi in 1668. This is a simple experiment. People were saying that if you leave a piece of meat and you come back days later, you'll see maggots on it. And people thought at the time that these maggots came from the meat. So they were like created de novo. So he put a piece of meat in an open jar, then he put another one in a sealed jar. And he noticed that in the sealed jar, no maggots were there, whereas with the other one, there were maggots. And then he put a jar with like a transparent film on it, and he observed that flies were coming to the first one, cannot get to the second one, got to the third one, but maggots on the third one were on the film, not on the meat. So this was direct proof for people at the time, this is not technology-oriented people, that actually the maggots came from the flies, i.e. they were going to become flies. So flies brought flies, it's not the meat that created it. That's the concept. 200 years later, Pasteur came about. We all know about Pasteur and the pasteurization of things. Pasteur's experiment was pretty simple. By that time, they had identified microorganisms, bacteria, and he thought that if there's a flask, you apply heat to it, you let it settle down, eventually that flask will be sterile. And even if the seal is not broken, this flask continues to be sterile. Why? Because the condensed air will form a water seal, so nothing can come in, and it will continue to be sterile. Whereas if you break the flask, bacteria comes about in the liquid. So the conclusion was that there are microorganisms somewhere in the air, maybe, that's flying through, maybe through specks of dust that we cannot see. So this is the concept when you buy pasteurized cheese from the supermarket. This is what they're doing. They're just heating and sealing and etc. Okay. And then came Darwin right about the same time, where he wrote the famous book, The Origin of Species. And in that book, interestingly, we all know, I think, that Darwin says that we evolved somehow over millions of years from maybe fish, or maybe microorganisms, to fish, to apes, to humans. It's just he didn't call those mutations at the time because they didn't know DNA, but he called it evolution. So somewhere, somehow, we adapt to the nature that's around us. Nowhere in that book does he say anything about the actual origin of life. So he didn't actually venture into discussing how did it start. He just described the process. So when you add all these things together, you start thinking that, okay, maybe I need to think a little bit more about this. Okay? By the way, Darwin was an agnostic. Does anyone know the difference between an atheist and an agnostic?
An agnostic does not deny or confirm the existence of God.
Correct. Whereas an atheist denies it, or does not want to think about it, right? So and the reason he became an agnostic is actually because he lost his daughter to measles, and then he rebelled against God. Okay? I'm touching upon religion a little bit because I'm getting to it. Okay, here's an interesting thing. We call this the green man question. The green man, let's assume that there's an alien from Mars, a green man, that comes and visits us today. And let's assume that this green man gives us a list. Baby, coral, robot, computer, you have them, okay? If I ask every single one of you to classify those in front of you into alive or not alive, easy? Difficult? I think, I'm not going to waste your time with this, but I think that everybody will agree that we will classify them this way. Alive on that side, not alive on this side. Any concerns? Okay. Here's the interesting question. Since we all agree that we classified them this way, why? What makes these alive and these not alive? You might think it's a simple question, but I'm interested to know what makes you believe that a fly or a baby is alive, whereas a moon is not alive?
Its capacity to reproduce.
Capacity to reproduce, good one. Feelings, a better one. Consciousness. Evolution. Okay, let me address the reproductive one. Reproductive is the ability for you to recreate something, right? Crystals do that. Put a crystal, it will continue to do that. Is it alive? I'm just... Sort of, yes. So should it be on the other side? There's a moral dilemma in this. You just don't know how to classify it. Is everything alive? Is the automobile alive?
Yes, of course.
Does it have a life? Does it have the ability to reproduce?
No, but it's alive and it can lie.
Anybody else wants to venture in?
The live things, they have water.
I'm sorry?
The category of the living things, each part has water.
Water.
Yes.
And air.
Excellent. Excellent. And air. Okay, let me ask you this. If I was to put a virus in here on that list, where would you put it? Alive? Doesn't have water.
It can reproduce.
It can reproduce. Can it reproduce on its own? No. It needs another cell to do that. So you see, the image becomes blurry. I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just pointing out questions that make you think about, is this alive or not? In the field of medicine, which is where I live and belong, I can't tell you if a virus is alive or not. Logically, I could say that yes, it is alive. Is a bacteria alive where it's not reproducing? You can have bacteria millions of years old, not reproducing. The minute the environment is favorable to them, they start reproducing. That's why you put things in the freezer, for example. Meat.
It's not about reproducing on its own. It's about whether it's capable of reproducing.
Is it capable consciously of reproducing or not, Kamal?
Technically, even human beings. Technically, even
Now we
human
know
beings
about
are.
DNA, yeah? So all the living creatures, they have their DNA.
Perfect. I didn't address Magali's perfect thing. They have feelings. Does a fly have feelings? Just a question. Maybe, we don't know. Okay. So scientists argued about this for many, many years, and this is the definition they came up with. It's incomplete, but they say that a system is living if it can transform external matter or energy into internal processes to self-maintain and to produce its own components. They didn't even dare say to reproduce. Just the fact that they can assemble things to be able to propagate, that's a sort of a definition of alive. And here we come back to the list, because at that time there were no robots, but robots can do that. So are they alive? I don't know. Okay. Are you bored yet, or can I continue? Azim. All right. So let's go into the idea of what the scientists call the primordial soup. So now we're not going to talk about organisms and alive and etc. They even went further down. Let's understand it a little bit more. It's sort of like when you analyze a stone, you go to the little structure, to the pebble, all the way down to the atom. So now we're not going to talk about living creatures. We're just going to talk about a primordial soup where, if we think of Earth when it was formed, there was this gaseous mix that eventually solidified into rock, blah, 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 nitrous, sulfur, oxygen, sun, heat, water, wind, air, etc. Molecules floating around, and they cause something that could fit that definition of can I reproduce or can I form something that can reproduce. And this experiment was actually done in the lab. Stanley Miller studied prebiotic chemistry. That's what we call prebiotic, meaning before creatures, okay? He was able to produce amino acids. Let me just here tell people who may not know. Proteins that cause, we are made of proteins, muscles, etc. The basic building blocks are amino acids. Well, we know from us that there's 20 essential amino acids. These could never have been produced in a lab, never till today. They could only produce 10 out of the 20. So obviously there's a missing link, although they tried to mimic Earth's conditions at that time. Also, what we know about amino acids is that they come in different forms. We call them in the medical word L and D forms, because if you put a mirror, part of it is flipped like a mirror image, but the other part is the same. The interesting thing is that they were able to produce both D and L forms when they reproduced Earth's atmosphere. However, in real life, we all have the L form. We never have the D. So what happened there? Are we missing something? Or is the lab not necessarily mimicking nature, although they really came very close? So in an experiment where there was no oxygen, okay, they thought they mimicked Earth, but then somebody found that there was a little bit of oxygen. This, I'm talking about Earth billions of years ago when oxygen was not there. And this minimal oxygen may have caused this shift. This is L and D forms. You see this part is the same, but this one is flipped. Okay. So they said, okay, protein is not giving us the answer, so let's forget it. Maybe we can look further down and look into RNA. I think if I was giving this lecture 3 years ago, most of you would not know what RNA is unless if you're into biology. But after COVID, we all know what RNA is. Briefly, we all have DNA that has, it's a code that we have to translate into proteins. The messenger between this and this is usually a molecule called RNA. It's what translates the code into protein. So they thought, let's analyze that. Why? Because RNA, we know in the lab, has the capacity of replicating itself in some forms. So RNA molecules can self-replicate. Proteins are still required for life, because if you have just RNA, there's no life. And RNA molecules are very, very unstable. They cannot survive alone. And this is the reason why the COVID vaccine has to be put in freezers. It's because it's from an RNA which is not stable. So you can produce it in the lab, but it can never be produced spontaneously. If you put the building blocks of an mRNA, it will never find itself to propagate. You have to actually form it. And the nucleotides, which are the building blocks of RNA, also have never been produced spontaneously. So going back to Earth, what happened? How did the mRNA or the DNA come about? Was there something else? And to produce them, you require enzymes, which have to come from somewhere. Okay. Another bracket. So these are questions now. They're like in the open. Comes religion. I don't want to specify Christianity, Islam, and different kinds of religions because they all sort of say the same thing somewhere. The creation of Adam, right? In religion, I mean, if you read the scriptures, Adam was the first man. There's no mention of humans before Adam. Actually, and I'm not a theologist or a religious, scholar. But when you read, and you read a little bit critically, and you look at some analysis, they can find that even in the book of Genesis, there is alluding that there may have been other living creatures similar to man, but it was never specified as there was man. There was dust that became Adam, essentially. And effectively, this is the first version of Genesis. So I'm going to read it. So God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This is actually written in the Old Testament. So basically, even with this statement, we're not sure if it was a male or a female even. I don't want to go into what's going on right now with the gender thing. That's not what this is. The idea here is that, are we creating a human, or are we creating humanity, or are we creating the idea of this is from here on, this is what man should be like, man meaning man and woman. In second version, then the Lord God formed a man from the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. This is a little bit more into like God created man, if we want to simplify it. Okay, fine. By the way, homo, I just put this here because homo comes from the word humus, which is earth. So even when we call homo habilis or homo whatever, homo sapiens, it's alluding to the fact that they came from the earth. Very good. So let's accept this, and let's say, okay, good. Adam was created. And then, further along, God made Eve for Adam's comfort. Many people would argue with that piece of information, but that's okay. Eve was made from Adam's rib, and Adam fell through gluttony, which is his first sin, and the first sin, gluttony, is actually indulgence. It's not intercourse or sex or something else. So the first sin of Adam was indulgence, and we all know the story from here on, with the serpent and the apple, etc. So this was Adam's first mistake. This is his second mistake, obviously. She was asking him if she looks fat, and he just said, just a little. Okay. I want to stop for a second. I'll come back to religion. This is me. This is what I love. I'm going down to the cell, okay? I'm not going to go into all the different aspects of what the cell does, but every single cell in our body, almost, sort of looks like this, either the right or the left figure. The whole concept, and I think everybody knows this, the cell, there's a membrane, there's a bunch of stuff inside of it. That's how it works. There's a nucleus, which has another membrane. Why? To protect what's inside, which is the genetic material DNA, which we inherit from our parents. Correct? We all know that DNA is in the nucleus, and when we reproduce, we double that DNA, and the cell splits, right, amino? And everything happens that way, and life propagates. What was interesting for me, this is when I was in the first year of microbiology in college, I was fascinated by the fact that in the cell there are these little things called mitochondria, and the mitochondria are basically little things inside the cell that are responsible for utilizing stuff to produce energy that the cell needs to kind of work. I'm simplifying a lot. And it also detoxifies the cell. So when there is waste products, it detoxifies it, otherwise the cell dies. The interesting about this is that the mitochondria have their own DNA. Has nothing to do with the nucleus. Okay, interesting. Why? Because they're crucial. They don't want to rely on waiting for the DNA to come from here to there to produce things. So, be it Darwin or be it religion, whatever you believe in, somehow that DNA came into the mitochondria. And that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what we all were taught in biology. We all inherit genes from our parents, correct? So you need man, woman to propagate one set of genes this way, one set of genes that way, except for the mitochondria. The mitochondria is not in the nucleus, it's in the cell. So it's the powerhouse of the cell. This is another picture telling you how complicated the cell is. And it distinguishes the fire, the toxins, etc. And this is what I want to get to. This is what I do on a daily basis. This is the egg with mitochondria and DNA. It's very simplified. When intercourse happens or when sex happens and the sperm goes to the egg, the sperm has two sets of mitochondria by the tail just to feed the tail that energy to work. When that sperm enters the cell, it actually doesn't enter the cell. It's just spitting out the genetic material inside. So these mitochondria stay outside. Now this is inside. It goes here and the cell starts multiplying. Okay, our genetic material, the 46X, the chromosomes, come from man, woman. The mitochondria is all female. So every single one of us carries genetic material from mom, dad, but we also carry only from mom the mitochondrial DNA. This is where it became interesting. Okay, so if my ancestors, if I go back to my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., I can theorize that some of my DNA came from a Neanderthal man at some point, or from Adam if I'm too religious, okay? But I can also tell you that my mitochondria came from a female origin. When people discovered this, it opened that door again to scientists to start analyzing backwards what came first. So they went and looked at all types of DNA from a different angle. Do we just look at the cell, the nucleus, or do we look at both? In Nature magazine, people looked at the Y chromosome, theorizing that the Y chromosome only comes from the man, right? So if I am a son, I got my Y chromosome from my dad, not from my mom. And they tried dating this backwards, and I got my mitochondrial DNA from my mom, right? Here's another diagram that tells you this is a person who got their DNA from both mom and dad, whereas the mitochondrial is only coming from the woman. So far it's clear? Okay. Enters the idea of mutations. DNA goes through mutations. We all mutate, but it's a very, very slow process. If it was big, we would mutate ourselves out of existence. And people have a formula to calculate how many mutations are there. So when we look at our DNA, compare it to somebody who lived 1,000 years ago, we can predict how many generations there was, etc., etc. And this is how they calculated backwards. And basically, given mutation rates, there was no way on Earth that we would have evolved from two ancestors. If that was the case, we would all be extinct at this point in time. Somewhere, somehow, according to science, we started out as a group of people who genetically got to this point in time. This is not saying religion is wrong. This is just saying fact. How we interpret religion is a different story. This is why I said that I don't know if we can say that it all started with Adam and Eve. I could say that, genetically speaking, we started out a little bit before. And they calculated that we probably started, sorry, I don't know what happened here, just one second, okay. So they calculated that somewhere there was a group of 10 to 20,000 people that gave a rise to the population that we have today. The genomic evidence was, this is somebody who actually is a theologist, who said, after looking at all the evidence, that we can no longer believe the Genesis account. This was later modified to, we have to modify our understanding of Genesis. But the evidence is overwhelming. Same thing. We were traced to a group of people, not to a single couple. And the population supposedly started out as 10,000. This guy, again, is a senior fellow with a Christian group. This is not somebody who is not religious talking. Time. When they reanalyzed everything based on mitochondria and based on nucleus DNA, they were able to pinpoint that Eve lived in Africa around 200,000 years ago, whereas Adam lived around 100,000 years ago. And when we discovered this, it was a big thing. And you know, when Times Magazine takes a story and blows up the titles, now they were all of a sudden saying that Eve came before Adam, which was totally in conflict with everything that we had believed in. I'm not saying that this is true. All I'm saying is that this is the documentation of how things happen. Okay. What about Noah? There's another story here. If we believe the scriptures, Adam, Eve, the creation, blah, 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 sin, blah, 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 and then God was angry, flooded everything, took Noah with his 3 sons and their 3 wives, and then they were the ones who then later on propagated life again. So these calculations that they did should have pinpointed to Noah's time, if we were to believe that this is the real story. And those are the 3 sons. And actually, there are genetic studies. I don't want to go into too much detail here because it gets really annoying. But there are different clusters of mutations. And when you cluster them together, you can see that they map to a tree. And you can see that there are 3 branches to that tree. This is true, by the way. And they are theorizing that these are the 3 branches, that 3 sons of Noah. So we all came somewhere from one of those. So this revalidates the story that religion says, okay, or if we want to believe that. I read a lot about how people interpret these things. And with the flooding, people say that, if a flood occurs, let's say now, I mean, unless you live in Mars, you would know about it like the second minute. Whereas on those days, if flooding existed, let's say in Europe, somebody living in Africa would never even know that this thing existed. So they theorized that maybe the flooding occurred in a population that was sinning, blah, 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 but there were others somewhere that were still alive and propagating life, okay? This is a timeline of what we know today if we go and analyze religious scripture and try to date things because of scripture. And every single book that you read dates things back to around 4000 BC. So the theory is that Adam and Eve came into existence somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000, depending on what you read, 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. Well, the science is telling us that our DNA is carried from people hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years ago. Again, not to say that this contradicts the other thing, it's just saying that maybe our whole definition of being human does not relate to biology. Maybe we were something else, and then all of a sudden, with the apple and all of those things that happened, we woke up and suddenly humanity started from that point on. So what was before that point was biology and not humanity. I don't know. I'm just trying to point them. So when we look at history and prehistory, those are facts that you could date. This is where Adam happened. 1,000 years later, Noah happened. And everything before that, there was life. There was human or semi-human existence, right? And it's dated all the way back to about 3 million years ago. Of course, prehistory, there was this guy, but we're not going to talk about him. Nice transition to this. Okay, so the idea now is, okay, if we think about it, there's the apes and there's the Homo sapiens and Homo erectus, whatever. How come we don't see apes doing this? Yet.
Because it's a transition that takes millions of years.
Right. But what happened at that point in the branch where this happened and those continued to...
The break of Pangea.
Yes. We're going to talk. Okay? So the idea is that, yes, we don't have this now. And there are some people who actually did another sort of interesting experiment. They put a bunch of monkeys in a room with typewriters and let them stay there for about a month. This is in England, by the way, the British Council, okay? And the British National Council of Arts. And they put 6 monkeys for a month in a room with typewriters, and they just let them hang. And then after that, they analyzed everything that they could have typed. And the idea was not to see if they can type or not, or if they couldn't find a single word that made any sense. Not even the word I, meaning I with space before, space after. That's the concept. And they actually calculated that for I to happen, it's like 1 in 27,000 chance. What about the chance of writing a Shakespearean sonnet by these monkeys? It's about 30 to the power 468, which if you multiply that number, it's more than there is atoms in the universe. So obviously this is science also pointing out that there is something that we don't understand and that maybe there is divine intervention somewhere that all of these things happen. By the way, people also analyze that if you put amino acids floating in a river, for them to find themselves and replicate and all of this, it's even more astronomical than this. And here you go into the theories that are there creatures from out of the space, out of this universe maybe there's something we don't understand. Who is God? Why is God doing this? Is God beyond, is an entity beyond what we can imagine? And this is where you can see that scientists actually reverted back to religion, and you see a lot of scientists who now, are more religious than not. Okay, I can tell you from my own experience, I work with embryos day in, day out. I help people conceive babies. We put the sperm and the egg in a petri dish and we leave and we come back the next day. Some of them make an embryo and others don't. I don't know why. It's divine intervention. When my patients come to me and say, thank you for getting me pregnant, first of all, I never got you pregnant, but the idea is that I didn't do anything. I just put one on one near one another, and something happened that made them do this. So how do we reconcile these questions? Is science contradicting religion, do you think? We have traces of Neanderthal. You can't deny this. This exists. What about Adam and Eve? Of course I have traces of something called Adam and Eve, but they're 6,000 years old, right? What about the other stuff? Adam and Eve were created as adults, by the way, right? They were never teenagers or toddlers, etc. There are also recounts that Adam lived until age 900 something.
Does it mean that teenagers are not created?
No, I don't think so. But I think that there's something to the story that I think, personally, that there was some divine intervention at some point in the creation of life. Was the first ancestor male or female? Based on DNA, you might theorize that Eve came before Adam. I mean, you can't deny that fact that mitochondria exist from the egg, unless we discover something that we still can't detect. I want to put that out there. But as of now, that's the fact. And some people theorize that mitochondria are a separate entity altogether. It's sort of like a virus that came in and lives symbiotically with the cell. Maybe they're of a divine, or not divine, but like an alien form. I don't know. How to account for genetic material that is shared in nature. This is interesting. I'm going to sort of end with this. If we bring Tom Young, our famous Tom Young, and I ask you, how much genetic material does Tom share with me? If we analyze my DNA and his DNA, they're 99.9% exactly the same. He's much blonder and handsomer than me, more handsome. And he's more of an artist than me. And that whatever 1% of accounts for that difference. Okay, what's the similarity between me and Lena? To just take it into another dimension. Almost 99.9%. These are the similarities. We share the same genetic code with a fly, with a fruit fly, at about 44%. That's about half. Half of their genetic material is the same as us, and look at the diversity. We even share with plants 18% of our DNA. And in the creation story, or in Genesis, or what have you, we talk about Adam specifically and the creation of man, but we sort of assume that, not assume, but like Earth was created. Okay, did we plants, animals, blah, blah, blah. They were all created. How? They don't go into details. But their genetic material is exactly like mine, in a sense. So there are many questions that we don't know. We don't have answers for. Adam had these questions for Eve. Eve had these questions for Adam. They didn't know. There are many times where we theorize things and we're not going in the right direction. Sort of like when Adam asks her if that's a salad and she tells him that's your dirty laundry. They didn't know. We don't know. I think there's a lot more that we can discover that will shed lights on this. But what I think is that it's a shame if we don't think about them. It's kind of nice to kind of investigate. I always end with art, so here's a picture of a tree with the shades, and the birds are on the shades. They could belong to the tayyar, but they just don't know where they're going. The idea is that we might be those birds. We might be looking at the shades and analyzing the shades where the truth is something else. So thank you. I think I sort of covered it. Questions, open, discussion.
So if we share 99.99% DNA,
Yes.
what's the difference?
The difference is significant enough for you to know how to work a pen and for me to kind of play the piano. The difference is very minimal. You know, if you talk about the genetic code, there are billions of nucleotides, thousands and thousands of genes. Most of them are silent, they are never expressed. We work based on a minimal expression of our genes. And even with that minimal expression, that 1.1% difference between Fadi and me, or between Hanan and me, a huge difference, okay? It makes her a better person than me.
I think we only differ in what we say.
What do you mean?
We only differ in what we say.
Okay. How do you explain blonde hair and...
There's no difference.
But there is a difference.
Yeah, but the essence of the difference is not important.
I'm not talking about the essence. I'm talking about, yes, it's not important. I agree with you. Me and you could be the same human with the same values, blah, blah, blah. I'm accounting for, okay, what is the difference between, let's take it to the extreme, me and you and two Japanese women. Same, maybe we might have the same essence, but that change that makes them a woman, me a man, them blonde, them short, I'm tall, blah, 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 that is a genetic difference. You can't deny it.
But it will filter in what we say. Because Japanese women, they say things that might create a Japanese society that will drive them to live the way that they are living.
Okay, so I will take that and I will argue in a different way. You're talking about language. Language.
No, not language. I'm talking about what we say. It doesn't matter what language.
What we express. What we think. We have to be...
When we say things, we give orders sometimes with what we say. Sometimes nations move.
What about someone who doesn't say anything? Lahza, there are people who can't say anything, they think it. So let's not say, let's say think. Got it? Okay. So in that sense, I agree with you. There is a big argument about evolution and the development of people with thought. Descartes, okay? Abstracted himself from everything, came back to, I think, therefore I am. He couldn't deny that. And then he rebuilt everything after that. We all learn until here. But the interesting part is how he rebuilt it again. Okay, so I think, therefore I am, so it's the brain, right? Or thought, let's put it that way. Because some people argue that the heart can think. Or the ego, or the id, right?
And that's what makes us human, is the self-reflective awareness.
So are you saying that your cat is not self-aware? You might answer that much better than we do, Dakmara, with your cats.
Yes. Sometimes I guess she is...
So we don't know because she doesn't speak.
But that's the Apple story. It's the moment where we became self-aware. It's not that there ever was an
Excellent.
in history.
My
It's
question.
just a symbolic myth.
Okay, so my question along those lines is that, was it that breath of air that created Adam, if we want to, is it just putting that oomph so that we have a say or we have a thought and we go from there? I don't know. I'm just...
It's not even a thought. I guess it's capacity of abstraction.
Then another with her art.
Further than thoughts and language.
It's interesting. This is the thing. There's something about before Adam is that there were no writings. So we don't know. There's no account of how these people lived. We don't know if they had a conscience or not. There are some symbols on caves and walls. We might extrapolate from that according to our norms, but who says that these were their norms? We might be interpreting it in a totally different direction than what they were trying to tell us. Maybe when they drew a horse on the thing, maybe they wanted to eat the horse, maybe they worshipped the horse. I don't know. we try to theorize based on what we think. It's sort of like the story of the pyramids and how were they built. To this day,
that was abstraction, the difference between the horse and the image of the horse.
correct. But to this day, people talk about the pyramids, how were they built. We still analyze how they were built according to our norms. Because we know how machines work, we know how people work. Who knows how they worked at that time?
We don't know.
Exactly. There's no real concrete evidence. Let's put it that way. From a scientific point of view, look, I struggle sometimes with my scientific mind versus my artistic mind because I sort of live both. But the idea is that you cannot deny the existence of science, but you have to question it sometimes. I can tell you a little fact. When I went into medical school, one of the first medical exams that I took, I answered the questions, obviously correctly, otherwise I wouldn't be here. But on my last year of medical school, 4 years later, I had the exact same question. I still answered it right, but it was the different answer. So in 4 years, we went from this being correct to something else being correct. Which is why we, as doctors, continue to go to conferences, etc., and take exams. And what I would prescribe to you 20 years ago probably might be different today. So,
This is called the
These guys were scientists or artists?
who?
The guys who painted this painting.
Who knows?
Prehistory.
Look, I think
The relation between
I think that there's an artist in every single one of us. The idea is how much you can express it or how much you were given the right environment to express it. For example, this lady here can give us one of the most beautiful paintings ever, but she has to layer it 10,000 times before it comes out. Okay? It's her way. And it has to be at 3 a.m. Otherwise, the painting would not be done. That's Magali. But I would buy every single thing that she does. She's an artist. If I tell, I don't know, Lena to do the same thing, she would probably kill me. She doesn't want to work at 3 a.m. It's a different inspiration. I play the piano. I used to prepare for my concerts while studying history in school. I would put the history book and I would play, and that's how I would remember the things. Nobody can do that from my friends, at least, who play the piano. But they have a different way. Who's the artist? I don't know. I think we're all artists somewhere. So these guys were artists, but they could have been scientists. Exactly. So this is why I said every science begins as philosophy and ends as art, because it's all connected. It's a spectrum, but it's always there. Elio.
I have two things to mention. Related to Adam and Eve, we just see them as Adam and Eve as a woman.
Correct.
Maybe they are a metaphor, and the most important thing is the tree.
Correct.
The tree of life.
Correct.
Tree of knowledge.
Agree.
According to several schools,
Yes.
that's the most important thing.
Look what.
The stage that we shifted from the tree of life to the tree of knowledge.
I will add to this. If actually the apple was the culprit, would we still be eating apples? I mean, think about it. It's sort of weird. So it must have been symbolic somehow.
even Adam and Eve would be symbolic.
Exactly my point.
It's as soon as you look at a myth as actual history, then it loses its magic, its meaning. The whole point is that it's a symbolic myth. That's not to say it's not true.
Look.
It's true on another level.
Yes.
It's true in that emotion.
And this is exactly my point.
It's not history. To think of the Bible as history is...
If you talk to a born-again Christian, I have lots of friends who are born-again Christians, right? They believe that they were born on that day where they got, baptized. And I respect that. Is that true, metaphoric, word to word? No. So maybe this whole thing with creation and humanity, or origins of life, maybe there was something happening, and then we got baptized at Adam and Eve. We continued, So this breath of life may not have been really a physical thing. And again, I'm not questioning it. But how would you explain the dust? Is it maybe a metaphor that they used to, analyze that when people died, they turned into dust, went back to earth? Maybe, and that came up because people wrote this. Genesis is something that is written. It's an account that is written from something that was derived from a word of God. But somebody wrote it. So they would write it according to those norms. But they went further into telling us that God created, well, I'm going to call it humanity from this point on, as opposed to Eve and Adam, at that moment. And then he gave us free will, i.e., apple, and you had free will to eat it or not. Adam actually had free will to actually name the animals. If you read Genesis, God brings animals to Adam and asks him to name it. Is God not capable of doing that? There are many questions. I don't want to get into those, but the idea is that free will, not the apple, becomes important.
Because then the way we even speak about spirituality in the Abrahamic faith is to do with language. That every verb needs a noun. So we have this object called
in our dialect.
It's in our language. But that's only a grammatical convention. That in fact maybe everything is a verb.
Correct.
It's a constant process. So there's nothing outside of what's going on. God, there's no separation between God and stuff happening. Stuff happening is God.
I have a feeling you're going to paint this lecture.
It's all a process. There's no outside.
Yes, Elio.
Operating.
The second thing I want to give a little bit wider perspective related to DNA. We share 98% DNA with apes.
Correct.
Right? And
Except for our politicians. They share more. Yeah.
so you can see how much, and you mentioned the experiment, how much we can understand, we expanded beyond the apes.
Yes.
How about if aliens or other beings, they have 2% more than us?
Or even 0.1%.
And we have no ability, like the apes, they have no ability to understand us.
Yes. We have no ability.
Even see all that knowledge.
Look,
all that ability.
very interesting point, and I purposefully didn't want to get into alien life and whether there is or there isn't life and all that, because that's a whole topic on its own. But here's the thing that I alluded to in my talk when I said about the fact that some people believe that we don't even can fathom what God is, because probably it relates to that small point, is that if a little minuscule change in DNA can cause the difference between a man and an ape, or a man and a fly, or a man and a plant, imagine the difference that you have between us, and I'm going to call it, and something. Call it God, call it another supreme being, blah, blah, blah. And again, I want to mention again that many of those scientists which got to that point went back to religion and they became more faithful than not.
Do you mean that intelligence is of human beings is concentrated in this 2% difference?
No, because an octopus is much more intelligent than us if you analyze their behavior.
The correlate of this is that is this gap increasing with time? I mean,
I think it's decreasing, actually. Yes, just look at, in a way, when you start relying on technology a lot and forget about other stuff, yes. But does that mean that you're not advancing? No, because, like you talk to a kid today, he understands much more than what I did when I was 20. But does that make them intelligent? There's something called social intelligence. There's called emotional intelligence, and I think we're missing out on those. And it's the wrong word. Yeah. So again, who are we to judge if we're more intelligent than the next generation or not? If you look backwards, you might argue that yes, we are much more intelligent than my grandfather. But I can argue the opposite way. He made it at a time which was impossible for me to live through. Maybe they were more intelligent. So again, it's all about perspective. I actually have it, I think, on my profile that it's all about perspective. Perspective is very important. I'm looking at the audience here, I'm enjoying everybody's view. You're looking at me, you're looking at one person, but we're still in the same room. We're talking about the same
their
thing.
experience, since they discovered the
Correct.
fire, they were intelligent at this moment.
Yes.
So, and we
Yes, but biologically...
for them that we arrived maybe
Yeah.
to this...
Correct, Lina, but part of it also is that your body, and I'm talking to you as a doctor, your body also learned that fire is bad. Because the minute you come close to fire, you automatically remove your hand without thinking. That's evolution, that's genetics, that's DNA. So over, again, hundreds of thousands of years, this doesn't happen in 100 years or so. In 4 generations, you won't learn not to vote for the same people. We all know this. Okay? But in 100,000 years, genetically, you will be programmed not to vote for someone who wears a colored shirt, especially orange. Bafine, I cannot. Okay, does that make sense? I tried to summarize as much as possible. This is a very huge topic, but in the light of Lina's stars and Earth and Eve, we had to kind of mention this. Thank you.